Hey, welcome back to this next section. And first of all, I want to say congratulations and also a big thank you for making it this far in the course and for sticking to the course. I really appreciate all the time you spent watching the lectures. I hope you enjoyed watching the lectures and that you also learned a lot from them. Now in this section, you're going to learn how to use Ajax with jQuery. Now, first of all, before we actually dive into the code, I want to talk a little bit about what Ajax actually is. So let me jump over to the browser where I have a quick diagram for you. It's going to make it a bit more understandable, I hope. Now, first of all, Ajax stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. And the really important part there is asynchronous. So you can make a request to some server, like in this example, to some web server here. That could be your own server, or it could also be the YouTube or some API server. But because the request is asynchronous, your page in the browser, so your client over here, is just going to go on with anything that's happening on the page, and it's not going to actually stop and wait for the request to come back. The request may come back, let's say 5 seconds later, and when it does come back, then the page is going to react to that and display the data, for example. But it's not going to block the page until that request has been answered. Instead, the client is just going to move on, pretty much like when you send an email to someone. You don't really stay there sitting in front of your computer and just waiting for some response to come back, but instead you go on with your life, and when the response does come back, you can still react to that. So this is very important because the user is still doing something on your page, like let's say they're filling out a form on your page, and then of course it should still be responsive. So the user should still be able to interact with your page while that request is still going on. Now let's take a closer look at the web server here. Now the web server, as I mentioned, could be any kind of server. In the following few lectures, we're going to use the Flickr server, for example, the big image site where you can host images, and it also has a public feed that you can access without any login or credentials at all. So you can just fetch some of the most recent photos that were uploaded, and you can do that via Ajax. Now there are also other sites and servers which offer publicly available data that you can access using Ajax, like for example YouTube, but you often need an API key. You can access YouTube, other Google services, the MovieDB, Flickr, and all those kinds of sites. And we're also going to look at a Pokemon API in one of the following lectures, where you can actually retrieve all the information about Pokemon from a REST API. So that's just going to be a fun lecture, but you're also going to learn a bit more about how to work with REST APIs and how to access them in jQuery. So most frequently, you're going to perform a GET request. So you're doing a GET request to the server to retrieve some data from a specific URL, but you can also do POST requests. And jQuery actually provides various different convenience functions so that you don't really have to go into all the configuration. And jQuery offers various different functions for you that make it easier to handle those different use cases. So let me just quickly jump back into the editor so that I can write you down what kind of functions are actually available. Now you can do a GET request very easily using the $.get function here, which is going to perform an Ajax request. There's also a POST function that you can use. There's the basic Ajax function that's a bit more advanced, where you can really set all the configuration options yourself. And there's also a function that we're going to use, which is called getJSON, which is another method to perform a GET request specifically to retrieve JSON data. So JSON is just JavaScript object notation, which is the object notation that you're already familiar with. But we're going to talk about that in more detail in one of the following lectures. Now, when you perform a GET request like that, then generally you have to follow the same origin policy, which essentially means you can only perform GET requests to your own server, but some of the other servers, like those public APIs or public feeds that we're going to use, They explicitly allow others to access them without any login or authentication. But if you try to access an API that requires you, for example, to have an API key that you can usually get very easily, but when you don't have an API key, you're usually not going to be able to actually retrieve your data. So it's going to give you an error because your request is not coming from the same domain. Like, for example, when you're accessing the YouTube API, then you're doing that request from a different server and not from the YouTube server, of course, unless you're working for Google and you're working on the YouTube team. And you're also going to see another advantage of AJAX calls, which is that you don't have to actually reload the page to be able to change its contents. So you can retrieve data from somewhere and then display that on the page without actually showing a new page or reloading the page. So that's also good for the user experience, where you can dynamically fetch data from some server and then show it to the user on time. Alright, so those are just some of the basics about what AJAX actually is, and also a very basic overview of what's actually going on between your script and some foreign server. Now in the following lectures, we're going to go right into the code again so that you can actually get some practical experience with this. So without further ado, let's move on to the next lecture.